Welcome back, everyone, to part 2 of our look at useful charts, family tree, so to speak, of Christian denominations. Today we're going to be taking a look at episode 2, which is Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches. And I'll admit up front, this is not an area where I'm going to have a ton of expertise. Probably of all of these episodes, this is the one I'm expecting to learn the most. I know a little bit about the Roman Catholic Church and its history, not as much about the Eastern Orthodox, so I'm excited to learn, and I am inviting all of you, especially those of you who may have these faith backgrounds, to give us your perspective. I think we've learned a lot from each other already. The comment section's been great. Thank you guys for the very civil way in which we've been having these discussions. Please keep that going. Religion can always be a really sensitive subject, but I feel like everybody from a variety of backgrounds, we've got agnostics and atheists and Muslims and Christians of various backgrounds and those with no real belief system, all participating in the conversation, and that's what I like to see because I think we can all contribute to our shared history. So if you did not see part 1, of my reaction, the link is in the description, as well as the link to part 2 without my commentary. And I want to give a thank you and a shout out to Matt, who did the work of making these videos, who promoted my reaction yesterday on social media. He's always been very supportive. So thank you, Matt, and thank you for continuing to help us all learn. One last thing before we dive into this one. If you're a member or a patron or have ever thought about being one, I just posted a link today for the pre-sale for our next group trip, which is going to be in April 2024, and that is going to be to Italy, Rome, Florence, with a little bonus at the end to Pompeii. So that is available to book now for our patrons and members, and that link, you'll see that there. It's going to go live for everybody else next week. Let's dive in.
Hi, this is Matt Baker. Welcome to episode 2 in my series on the family tree of Christian denominations. In episode 1, we looked at the origins of Christianity, how it started off as a sect of Judaism, but then went on to become a separate religion. We then discussed the first 2 church councils, which clarified what the major beliefs of Christianity were, and which produced the Nicene Creed. Finally, we looked at the next 2 councils, in which we started to get some smaller branches of Christianity splitting off from the rest.
And one thing I want to stop and comment on, because I had some folks commenting about things like, okay, well, they said, for example, that Arian Christians, that went extinct, and they took exception to that, saying, but no, there are people who have that belief system today. And yes, that is true, but that was not a continual movement of Christianity that has existed since that time. It's something that has come back, but what he's showing is how these branches of Christianity have grown and developed. So the fact that has come about again, I'm sure will probably show up later on in one of the later episodes, but it's not a continuous thing that has lasted from then until now.
Such as the Church of the East and the Oriental Orthodox churches. So in today's video, we're going to switch gears and focus on 2 of the largest branches of the tree, the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. Both of these very large churches can actually be divided into various smaller churches. So we'll be looking at how each group is organized, as well as the history behind how they ended up that way. Of special note will be some very recent developments involving the church in Ukraine.
Interesting. And it's kind of fun to be watching this right now, knowing that we just put this video up for our patrons and members about this trip to Rome, because that is going to include a visit to the Vatican, to St. Peter's Basilica, to see the Sistine Chapel, all that stuff. So it's kind of be cool to be learning about this right now, knowing that I'm going to get to see some of these sites next year.
But first, I want to point out that throughout this series, I'll be collaborating with the YouTube channel Ready for Harvest. As many of you already know, Ready for Harvest is all about Christian denominations, talking about their history and how they differ from one another. What I really appreciate about Ready for Harvest is that while its host, Joshua, belongs to one particular Christian denomination, he always approaches every topic from a very neutral point of view. So, for example, today, since I'm focusing on Catholic and Eastern Orthodox Christians, he too has released a very unbiased video about these same two groups.
Interesting.
So, if you want to get some extra information on what I'm discussing today, I definitely recommend that you watch his video after this one.
And just to comment about the whole idea of bias, I try to be as upfront as possible about my own biases, because every one of us, whether we think we do or not, we all have a worldview, we all have biases, and that infects everything that we say, everything that we do, and how we see the world. Now, we can attempt to be as unbiased as possible, but it's really, in the end, impossible for us to not carry some of our bias into these things. So, for example, a lot of you have asked, what is my particular belief system when it comes to Christianity? I am a part of, and listen, it's not a huge deal to me. I'm not like a hardcore doctrine guy, but I am a part of a Christian movement that I'm sure we'll talk about later on that grew out of something called the Restoration Movement. And I'm a part of a group of churches that are known as, they're non-denominational. We don't have a higher structure than the local church. There's not like a denomination, things like that. But we are non-denominational Churches of Christ and Christian churches, not associated with the ones that don't believe in having instrumental music, which is a totally different Church of Christ. But we're non-denominational. But that's basically what my main kind of belief system is. It's pretty similar to kind of a mainstream Baptist, I guess, in a lot of ways.
Okay, so before we jump into today's topic, let me first address a few things that came up in the comment section on episode 1. First of all, the word extinct. So, for example, I indicated on the chart that the Arian Christians went extinct.
We
While
just
many
talked
people
about this.
pointed out that the Jehovah's Witnesses are very Arian in their theology, which is true. I therefore want to clarify that whenever I show a group going extinct on this chart, I'm always referring to the original group, not to similar groups that may arise later.
Right.
This is especially important with regard to Jewish Christians. I got a lot of comments from people pointing out that Messianic Jews still exist.
Yeah, and I've got some friends who are Messianic Jews.
Again, this is correct. However, Messianic Jews do not trace a line all the way back to the original Jewish Christians from ancient times. Rather, Messianic Jews are more recent converts. So, in order to make things more clear, I decided to change the label Jewish Christians to Ebionite Christians. The Ebionites being one of the early Jewish Christian sects, similar to or the same as the Nazarenes. I also received several requests to include the Samaritans and the Karaites, so let's go ahead and add them to the chart. Now, some people, including the Samaritans themselves, think that the Samaritan religion is a direct continuation of the religion followed by the northern kingdom of Israel prior to the Babylonian exile.
And why is that? Because Samaria, I believe, was the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel. You have the division, according to the Bible, the division of the northern and southern kingdom happens after Solomon has died. There's kind of some havoc that happens between who's going to be his heir, and eventually the northern kingdom of Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah split, and Samaria is in the northern kingdom, and they're very much viewed as outsiders. That's why you have, for example, the story of the Good Samaritan that Jesus tells, which is a guy that was part of a group that were very much frowned upon by the traditional Jews. And there was a Samaritan woman at the well, this very famous scene in Scripture that, again, she feels that she's an outcast to Jesus, but he is very welcoming and loving to her instead.
However, from an academic perspective, it's more likely that the Samaritans emerged early on in the Second Temple period, when around 450 BCE, they built their own temple on Mount Gerizim. Now, there's a lot more I could say about the Samaritans, but since this series is focused on Christianity, I'll perhaps have to make a separate video about them at some other point. Now, what about the Karaites? If you haven't heard about them, basically the Karaites are Jews who do not accept the teachings of the early rabbis, as recorded in the Talmud. According to some people, they are the direct descendants of the Sadducees. However, the scholarly consensus is that this is not the case, because the Karaites did not actually emerge until the medieval period, which means that it is better to see them as an early breakaway group from Rabbinic Judaism.
Makes sense.
Rather than being completely distinct from it.
And I just want to say again how much I really appreciate all the work that Matt has done in the research on all of this. Not only to draw out the tree so it's visually appealing and easy to understand, but just giving us the background into all of this as well.
Another such breakaway group is Beta Israel, aka the Ethiopian Jews. Again, some people theorize that this group can trace their origins to pre-rabbinic times. However, it is clear from their language and customs that they did originally have connections to rabbinic Jews, but then this connection was severed for many centuries until they were once again reunited with the rest of Judaism in modern times. Okay, let's now turn our attention back to early Christianity. I mentioned last time something called the Pentarchy. The Pentarchy emerged in some sort of official way around the time of the Council of Chalcedon. Basically, by this point, there were 5 major cities that were key centers of Christianity within the Roman Empire.
And it's interesting to note about when this is happening too, right? Because this is also about the time that you're seeing a split in the empire itself between West and East. So, given the fact that at this point the church is becoming more and more closely associated with the Roman Empire, being the official religion of the empire now, it doesn't surprise me at all that as the empire goes, so goes Christianity.
Originally, there had been just 3: Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch. But when Constantinople became the new capital of the Roman Empire, it became important as well. And then there was, of course, Jerusalem, where the whole thing began. So by 451, the leaders of the church recognized 5 key cities. Each was called a patriarchate because each was governed by a special bishop called a patriarch, meaning father.
And that's where you get the word pope, right? Which is why it's not just the Bishop of Rome who is a pope, but some of these others have that title too.
I changed the chart a little bit to make what happened after the Council of Chalcedon a bit more clear. Basically, the majority of Christians in Alexandria, Egypt, and in Antioch, Syria, did not agree with the Chalcedonian decisions. They therefore broke away from the rest and eventually became known as Oriental Orthodoxy, which is distinct from Eastern Orthodoxy.
Which is interesting because isn't the word Oriental based on the word Eastern anyway? Orient and Occident being East and West. So it's just another way of saying Eastern Orthodox, really.
These days, the 2 largest churches within Oriental Orthodoxy are the Coptic Orthodox Church in Egypt and the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, which became independent from the Patriarch of Alexandria in 1959. However, I should point out that the church in Ethiopia has its own very unique history that goes all the way back to ancient times. And as I discussed in my series on Who Wrote the Bible, Ethiopian Christians have a unique version of the Bible that includes several extra books that are not found in most other Bibles.
And that also, again, makes sense because you've had this split and you basically have this church developing independently of the church in Europe. So you can expect to see these things. And Ethiopia's history is fascinating anyway, just because the connections that they have going all the way back to King Solomon and Israel, things like that. Really cool stuff. Might have to take a deep dive into that sometime.
Also, since I mistakenly didn't show a photo of the Ethiopian patriarch last time, I wanted to show him this time. This is Patriarch Abun Matthias, the spiritual leader of around 40 million Ethiopian Christians.
That's crazy.
Okay, so let's now return to the Pentarchy. although most of the Christians in Alexandria and Antioch became Oriental Orthodox, a minority did not.
So just before we get into this next part, just kind of a random observation here. Here in the United States, speaking as an American, if there was a denomination with 40 million people that were a part of it, that is huge. I mean, that's like 1/8, 1/9 of our population. And yet that's not a church that really I think most Americans, myself included, are very familiar with. But 40 million is not a small number. That is a huge chunk of Christians.
That's why I also show dotted lines that stay within the Eastern Orthodox section, which I've now decided to color red. The Christians in these areas that sided with Eastern Orthodoxy were originally known as Melkites, meaning imperial. That term will pop up again later, so I thought I'd point out its meaning now. But here's the thing. In the 600s CE, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem came under the control of the new religion of Islam. Therefore, these cities became less important in terms of Christian leadership, leaving only Rome and Constantinople as the two main patriarchates.
So that's an interesting observation that the rise of another religion, in this case Islam, like around 600 or so, that has a direct impact on the rise and fall of particular sects of Christianity, depending on where they are. And so this is a big part of why. I mean, imagine a situation where a religion rises in, say, Germany, and Italy and Western Europe all fall under the sway of that religion. We might be talking about the main center of Christianity then being in Alexandria or Jerusalem or Antioch. Because of the rise of Islam, Rome and Constantinople are going to become key centers, and eventually Constantinople is also going to fall under the sway of Islam, and so now Rome becomes the center of the Christian church.
For a bit of a power struggle eventually developed between Rome and Constantinople. On one side, there was the fact that Rome, as the original seat of imperial power, had been given, back in the early days of the Pentarchy, a sort of precedence over the other four cities. However, on the other side, there was the fact that Constantinople was now the seat of imperial power, and it was the Greek emperor in Constantinople that now appointed the Latin pope over in Rome. As the centuries went by, Rome and Constantinople drifted further and further apart.
And another thing you're going to see, I mean, you hear that Greek emperor appointing a Latin pope. Right now, you still have the situation where the secular, I guess technically, government is the more powerful and influential. And you're going to see, once we get to the time of Charlemagne, for example, you're going to start to see this kind of mutually beneficial relationship exist between the church in Rome and the governments, these kingdoms in Western Europe especially, but also Central Europe, where the Pope is going to have a great deal of authority and influence over these situations. And that's because of the way in which they kind of rise together.
As Europe became divided between the Holy Roman Empire in the west and the Byzantine Empire in the east. This came to a head in 1054 with what's called the Great Schism. The Great Schism can be blamed on many different things, but I'd like to point out just two. One was a disagreement over whether or not Rome and its bishop, the Pope, was the head over the entire Christian church. According to Constantinople, the Pope was just a first among equals.
And one of the things that the Roman Church points to give it legitimacy as the Pope being the head over all is that they will say that Peter was the first Pope. And Roman Catholics, please correct me if I am wrong in my assessment of this, but there's something known as the doctrine of the keys, and there's a situation where Jesus talks about whatever you forgive on earth will be forgiven in heaven, whatever you do not forgive. He basically talks about earthly authority having spiritual authority. And there's also the scripture where, for my background and my belief system, we look at this conversation that happened between Peter in Jesus, where Jesus is sitting around with his disciples and he says, "Who do people say that I am?" And they start saying, "Well, some people say you're John the Baptist, some people say you're Elijah," and all this stuff. And then he says, "Well, who do you say that I am?" And Peter, who always was willing to speak up and say what was on his mind, said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus said, "And I say you are Peter," which was his nickname. His name was Simon. Peter means rock. And he said, "And upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it." Well, in the Catholic Church, Peter is the first pope, and it's built on him as the rock. In my belief system, we see the rock as being that statement, that confession of faith. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And so I just baptized a couple of people this past Sunday, and we ask people to repeat that confession of faith, that I believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. And so that's what we see. And so I think there's kind of a fundamental difference of our view of Peter as giving that confession of faith that we all believe versus him being the first pope and being the one that was the first leader of the church, and that now the Pope is the vicar of Christ. He is the successor to Peter and has that same role as leader, as head of the church.
In other words, he held a special place of honor, but in practical terms, he held no more power than the Patriarch of Constantinople. However, according to Rome, the Pope did have actual authority over the entire church. The other major difference related to the Nicene Creed, which I discussed in episode 1. In fact, I created a bit of a stir because, as an example, I showed the version of the creed used these days by Catholics and Protestants, rather than the one used by Eastern Orthodox Christians. The difference is this line here, known as the filioque, meaning and from the Son. So, as you can see, Catholics and Protestants say that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, whereas the Eastern Orthodox Christians say that he proceeds from the Father only.
And listen, in Matt's defense with all of this, when you're putting together something so huge and detailed as covering all of this, right? And anytime we cover any historical topic, same is true for me. There are always going to be people, especially when you've got well over 1 million subscribers like Matt does, there's always going to be somebody who knows more about a particular topic than you do in your research. And so there are going to be things that you miss. There are going to be nuances that get kind of misinterpreted, or just in your research, things that you don't fully comprehend. And so when you've got this video and you put it out to 1.5 million people, suddenly there's going to be a few people that are going to say, "Hey, wait a second, you got this wrong," or "There's more information you need to be aware of." And so I give him a lot of credit for taking that feedback and building it into part 2, because this is how we all learn together. There's always somebody who knows more about a particular topic than we do.
Because of these differences and many others, East and West parted ways in 1054. Now, I should make it clear that it would be incorrect to say that the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church started only in 1054. Instead, it would be more accurate to say that they both started in the 1st century and that they were simply united up until 1054. So what about the popes then? I mean, the ones from Peter up until Pope Leo IX in 1054. Well, the difference is that Catholics claim that those popes were the leaders of the entire Christian church, whereas in the view of the Eastern Orthodox Church, these popes were simply the bishops of Rome, who, as I mentioned earlier, were, in their minds, simply the first among equals.
And I just want to say one thing I really love that the Roman Catholic Church has going for it, as someone who's a pastor myself, is that if you're a priest in the Roman Catholic Church, or a bishop or a cardinal or whatever you might be, they have something called apostolic succession, which is that you can go in and you can trace their kind of spiritual ordination lineage all the way back. I don't know if it can go all the way back like to Peter and stuff like that, but I know that if I'm a priest, I can say, well, here's who ordained me, and here's who ordained them, and here's who ordained them. And you can kind of trace it all the way back, kind of this spiritual genealogy, which is really, really fascinating and cool stuff.
Okay, so let's now look at how each of these churches are organized today, starting with the Eastern Orthodox Church, which sees itself as a single church, but can actually be divided into 15 equal churches called autocephalous churches. Basically, being autocephalous means that the leader of that church does not have to answer to anyone higher up, other than God, of course.
So autocephalous, cephalus meaning from kind of a head thing. So that makes total sense. It's all a bunch of churches with a common belief system and common way of doing things, but with autonomy, basically.
However, the Patriarch of Constantinople is given special precedence and is considered first among equals. This is why the Patriarch of Constantinople is called the Ecumenical Patriarch. Ecumenical meaning representing more than one group. Currently, that position is held by Bartholomew I. Initially, the Eastern Orthodox Church consisted of only 5 autocephalous churches. These were the 4 out of the 5 patriarchates from the Pentarchy, as well as the Church of Cyprus, which had always been seen as being independent, all the way back to ancient times. However, over time, more autocephalous churches were added by Constantinople, such as the Bulgarian Orthodox Church in 927, the Serbian Orthodox Church in 1219, and most importantly, the Russian Orthodox Church in 1589.
And this all makes sense because as the church grows, as its influence grows, as new countries emerge, because you have nationhood becoming a thing. I mean, the idea of a modern nation doesn't really exist even at this time, but these distinct identities in places like Russia, you see these churches cropping up, and you can see the very specific geographic way in which this is happening, right? This is Eastern Europe, Western Asia, that kind of thing.
I say most importantly because nowadays the Russian Orthodox Church is by far the largest of the various Eastern Orthodox churches. It is currently led by Kirill, who holds the title Patriarch of Moscow. The Church of Greece and the Romanian Orthodox Church were the next 2 Eastern Orthodox churches to become autocephalous in 1850 and 1885, which is after each became independent from the Ottoman Empire. The remaining 5 churches all became autocephalous in the 20th century, or in the case of the Macedonian Church, just last year in 2022. Which leaves 2 gray areas to discuss. The first being the Orthodox Church in America, which originated as a branch of the Russian Orthodox Church.
I was going to say what you have in America then, because we're talking about a new country on the other side of the planet, things like that, is that these are immigrants that are coming from other places, specifically probably Russians, who are then going to start their own church. And we have right here in I don't think it's Orthodox, though. I think it's Catholic. Right here in the town I live in, we have a huge Ukrainian Catholic church. We also have a Maronite Catholic church. I'm getting ahead of myself because we haven't gotten to the Catholics yet, but Orthodox churches as well. There's, I think it's Romanian. Yeah, there's Romanian Orthodox churches in my area as well.
The Patriarch of Moscow currently recognizes the American Church as being autocephalous, but the Patriarch of Constantinople does not. When it comes to Ukraine, we get the opposite situation. There, the Patriarch of Constantinople recognizes the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, but the Patriarch of Moscow does not. And it's even more complicated.
I can't imagine why the Patriarch of Moscow might not recognize the Orthodox Church in Ukraine as autocephalous. Big surprise.
Than that. And that's because the history of Russia and Ukraine is, well, a bit complicated. You see, both countries trace their origins back to a medieval state called Kievan Rus, which was centered on the city of Kiev. When Christianity first reached that area, the church there was known as the Ruthenian Orthodox Church. However, over time, Kievan Rus disintegrated, and instead the city of Moscow became the dominant city in the region. It was at this point that the Russian Orthodox Church was established, replacing the Ruthenian Orthodox Church. Eventually, all Eastern Orthodox Christians in Ukraine ended up under the jurisdiction of Moscow. However, after the fall of the Russian Empire, some churches in Ukraine declared independence and started calling themselves the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church.
So again, what do you have? You have the close ties between what's happening with the government politically and what's happening with the church. As one goes, so goes the other.
Or UAOC. This church operated separately from the UOC, which still came under the jurisdiction of Moscow. This is why later the letters MP were added to the name, to make it clear that it is part of the Moscow Patriarchate. To complicate matters further, a third Ukrainian church emerged after the fall of the Soviet Union. This one called itself the UOC-KP, the KP standing for Kiev Patriarchate. Now, obviously, having three different Eastern Orthodox churches in one country is not ideal. So, in 2018, there was an attempt to merge all three churches into a single church, which would become known as the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. The merger was mostly successful, and now around 80% of Eastern Orthodox Christians in Ukraine belong to the OCU.
And this is not a totally uncommon thing to see happen with denominations of Christianity. You see the same thing happen here in the United States, for example. Right now, of course, now they're splitting again, but you have, for example, in the U.S., as I'm sure we'll discuss in a few episodes, the United Methodist Church, which was a merger of the Evangelical United Brethren and the Methodist Episcopal Church. But the EUB was previously a split off of some other things, and it's complicated, but now the United Methodists are separating again. It's crazy.
However, it wasn't entirely successful. For one thing, there are still some churches that are attached to Moscow, although since the Russian invasion.
And now I got to pause because now that I'm thinking about it, and this is where my mind goes and things like this. I think the EUB, the Evangelical United Brethren, might have separated into the Evangelical Church and the United Brethren, and then the United Brethren joined. I got to look it up now because I can't remember. Nope, I was right the first time. It was the EUB.
Of Ukraine in 2022, these are becoming less. And officially, the UOCMP has now cut ties with the Russian Orthodox Church. Secondly, there was also a disagreement between the newly appointed leader of the OCU, Epiphanius, and the former leader of the UOCKP, Filaret. This disagreement led to Filaret attempting to revive the UOCKP, although so far he's had only limited success.
And why does all this happen? Because we are human beings, and we all have biases, we all have varying beliefs, we all have egos, and all of that stuff gets in the way, and it causes division. It's nothing new in religion versus politics versus family life. Happens everywhere.
So basically, while there is still some disunity, the new OCU is now the main Eastern Orthodox Church in Ukraine. Now, before we move on, I do want to point out the growing rift between the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople and the Patriarch of Moscow. For over 500 years now, Moscow has seen itself as being the Third Rome. And since the Russian Orthodox Church is by far the largest of the various Eastern Orthodox churches, it has at times been seen as a sort of rival to the leadership of Constantinople. In fact, when the Ecumenical Patriarch recognized the new Orthodox Church of Ukraine, Moscow decided to break communion with Constantinople, which basically means that they're no longer on good speaking terms. This was made even worse when Patriarch Kirill came out as a strong supporter of the war on Ukraine, whereas Patriarch Bartholomew strongly opposed it. So it's yet to be seen whether or not the current schism will turn out to be a landscape-changing, permanent one. Okay, let's now talk about the Roman Catholic Church, by far the largest church in all of Christianity, with well over 1 billion members representing more than 50% of all Christians. Now, when most people refer to the Roman Catholic Church, what they're really referring to is the Latin Church, which is actually just one of 24 churches that make up the entire Roman Catholic Church. The other 23 churches are Eastern Catholic churches, which we'll be talking about shortly.
Yeah, and I was always very confused by this too. My wife's sister she was actually married in a Maronite Catholic church. The Maronites, my wife's brother-in-law is Lebanese, and they were Maronite Catholics. And Saint Maron is kind of like their patron saint, and so there's a Maronite Catholic church, and so they do things a little differently. And I always kind of understood them to be separate from the Roman Catholic Church, which they are separate from the Latin Church. But when I walked in, they had a picture of the Pope there, and I thought, oh, well, maybe they really are a part of this. So it's always been very confusing to me, so it's nice to see him kind of explain all of that.
But since 99% of Catholics belong to the Latin Church, let me take a moment to explain how the Church organizes those 1 billion plus members. So, unlike how the Eastern Orthodox churches are primarily based in single countries with perhaps some churches overseas, mainly for expats, the Roman Catholic Church is spread all over the world. So, what they do is divide the world into a few hundred provinces, like this. So, for example, although I'm not a Catholic, I live within the Catholic province of Vancouver, which includes most of British Columbia. Within that ecclesiastical province are 5 dioceses, and each one of those dioceses is led by a bishop. However, one of those dioceses is an archdiocese, led by an archbishop, who, in addition to being in charge of his diocese, is also in charge of the entire province. Now, within each diocese are a bunch of parishes, or local churches, each run by a parish priest. So the closest Catholic church to me happens to be this one, although I also happen to live fairly close to a cathedral. Growing up, I always thought a cathedral was simply an extra big and fancy church. Well, that's not quite the case. Each diocese has just one cathedral, and it's called that because that's where you'll find the bishop, or archbishop, for that diocese. Of course, the most notable thing about the Catholic Church is that above all the bishops and archbishops in the hierarchy is the Pope, who is the leader of the entire church. That person is currently Pope Francis, who is also the bishop in charge of the Diocese of Rome. So basically, whoever is in charge of Rome is in charge of the entire church. Now, like I mentioned earlier, in addition...
I believe Francis is the first Western Hemisphere, North and South America, because I get that little parts of Europe are in the Western Hemisphere too. First North and South America Pope we've ever had. He's from Argentina, so that's pretty cool.
In addition to the main Latin Church, there are also 23 other smaller churches, which are the Eastern Catholic churches. These operate independently from the main church, but are still under the jurisdiction of the Pope. Of the 23 Eastern Catholic churches, I am going to point out just the 10 largest. Let's start here at the bottom. These 3 churches all trace their origins to the Church of the East, which I mentioned earlier. Basically, what happened is that in 1552, there was a schism in the Church of the East that resulted in some congregations remaining in the Church of the East. These are the ones that became the Assyrian Church of the East and the breakaway Ancient Church of the East. But at the same time, there were other congregations that decided to join the Catholic Church instead. These became known as the Chaldean Catholic Church. Then there are the St. Thomas Christians from India. These Christians trace their origins back to the Apostle Thomas, who supposedly traveled all the way to India in the 1st century.
Yeah, so fascinating story. If you look at what is believed to have happened to the other 11 disciples, other than Judas, because we know what happened with him, Thomas is believed to have gone to India. Some people say that I think Bartholomew may have gone all the way to what is now Britain. And 10 of those 11 ended up becoming martyrs. Only John, who was exiled to Patmos, escaped being killed for his faith. But yeah, they ended up all over the place. And so it makes sense that they would be St. Thomas Christians in India.
At some point, though, the Christians in India became associated with the Church of the East. But then later, some joined the Oriental Orthodox churches, becoming known as the Indian Orthodox Church, while others joined the Catholic Church, becoming known as the Syro-Malabar Catholic Church.
Again, Matt, just kudos to you for keeping all of this somewhat straight and organized and making it understandable. This is such a massive mess of information, but he's really done a good job presenting it.
The Syro-Malankara Catholic Church is also based in India and consists of congregations that broke away from the Indian Orthodox Church. So note that there are two different Eastern Catholic churches based in India. The Syro-Malabar one follows Eastern Syrian traditions, whereas the Syro-Malankara one follows Western Syrian traditions. The largest Eastern Catholic Church is actually the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, with over 5 million members.
Wow.
This church traces its roots back to the Ruthenian Orthodox Church that I mentioned earlier. So basically,
and that's the church that we have here in my town. It's huge. It's by far the biggest Catholic church in the city that I live in, is the Ukrainian Catholic Church. They fly a Ukrainian flag. And honestly, I never really even noticed that it was Ukrainian, even though it says it on the sign and I drive past it all the time. I live like a mile from it until I started noticing the Ukrainian flag flying once the war started. But yeah, there's a big Ukrainian population here. In fact, I just did research for a guy in my church whose roots go back to, his last name's Moskalik, and they're Ukrainian.
Basically, back in the 1500s, there were some Christians in Ukraine that didn't want to join the Russian Orthodox Church, so they joined the Catholic Church instead. Now, there's also a Ruthenian Greek Catholic Church, but it actually has nothing to do with the Ruthenian Orthodox Church. It actually formed when certain congregations broke away from the Serbian Orthodox Church. Then there's the Armenian Catholic Church, which, as you might have guessed, is based on those who broke away from the main Armenian Church, which is associated with Oriental Orthodoxy. That leaves us with the Coptic Catholic Church, which broke away from the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate in Alexandria, and these three, which all broke away from the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate of Antioch. Which means that when it comes to the original Pentarchy, we now have way more than 5 patriarchs for 5 cities. So as I mentioned last time, there's an Oriental Orthodox Patriarch of Alexandria, who uses the title of Pope, but there's also a Greek Orthodox one. Well, now you know that there's a third Patriarch of Alexandria too, a Catholic one, who is the leader of the Coptic Catholic Church. In Antioch, it's even more complicated. There's the Oriental Orthodox Patriarch and the Greek Orthodox Patriarch. But there's also 3 different Catholic Patriarchs, representing the 3 different Catholic churches based in Syria. Now, I should mention, which I failed to do last time, that the city of Antioch is now actually located in Turkey. But for most of history, it was associated with the region called Syria. In Rome, of course, it's simple. There's just one patriarch, Pope Francis. And in Constantinople, it's mostly simple. There's mainly just Bartholomew I, the spiritual leader of the Eastern Orthodox Church, although technically the Armenian Church has a patriarch there too. Finally, in Jerusalem, there are 3 patriarchs. There's the main patriarch, who is Eastern Orthodox, but there's also a Catholic patriarch who represents the Latin Church,
It's an amazing
as well
name,
as
by the
an
way.
Armenian patriarch. So that takes care of the official branches of the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches. But before I go, I want to point out a few unofficial or independent branches. In 1870, the Roman Catholic Church held a council that is now known as Vatican I.
Yep.
One of the things that the council decided was that the Pope is infallible. Now, this doesn't actually mean that the Pope never makes mistakes or that he has the power to radically change church doctrine. It actually only applies to special statements that are clearly made ex cathedra,
From the
meaning
chair.
From the chair.
Yep.
Well, there.
Yeah, so when you hear that papal infallibility thing, understand exactly what he said there is the case. The Pope is only seen that way in basically like official doctrinal statements that are made. It doesn't mean he never lies to his mom, things like that. But it is a very serious topic because that is a fundamental difference between many Protestant denominations and the church, which is that, so for example, the movement that I'm a part of, one of the guys who founded it very famously said, where Scripture speaks, we speak. Where Scripture is silent, we are silent. In other words, meaning that where the Catholic Church would say, well, the Pope can issue doctrinal statements and he can give matters of faith, he can give instruction on things. Most Protestants would say, well, no. The Word of God ends with the Bible, and anything that's added afterwards is just man's opinion.
There were some Catholics that disagreed with the idea of papal infallibility, among other things. And there happened to be an archbishop in the Dutch city of Utrecht who had already gone independent. So basically, after Vatican I, a bunch of other priests joined with that archbishop to form the Old Catholic Church, also known as the Church of Utrecht. Today, they are led by this man here. Something similar happened in the 1960s, following the council known as Vatican II.
Yep.
One of the main things to come out of that council was the decision to hold Mass in local languages instead of Latin.
Huge
Again,
shift.
there were some Catholics.
I mean, you're talking about a change in well over 1,000 years of history, right? To switch from Latin to local languages. Big shift.
Who disagreed with the various decisions made at the council. This time, those who separated and formed independent Catholic churches became known as sedevacantists, which is a word based on the Latin for empty chair. Basically, these Catholics believe that the office of Pope has been vacant ever since Vatican II. One of the main sedevacantist churches is the Congregation of Mary Immaculate Queen in Nebraska. The Eastern Orthodox Church also has independent branches. There, the separatists are known as Old Calendarists or True Orthodox. The main issue for them was the switch that the Eastern Orthodox Church made in the 1920s from using the old Julian calendar to the new Julian calendar. Today, most Old Calendarists are found in Romania and Greece. Okay, so that was a look at the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox branches of Christianity. In the next episode, we'll be moving on to the Protestants and Restorationists. And
I'm part of what, like I said, the restoration thing, and that's also where you're going to get the Mormon church, things like that. So that'll be much more in my wheelhouse. I'll probably have a lot more to say on that one, but this was a learning experience for me, and I invite those of you who are a part of these Roman Catholic branches or these Eastern Orthodox ones, let us know your thoughts. What do you observe? What are you a part of? And can you add to the conversation? Let's learn together. This is an understanding of history for all of us because, like I said in the first episode, history is intertwined with religion. And at some point, I do want to take a look at Islam and Judaism and other even Eastern religions, and because those are all intertwined with history as well. So helps us all to learn and understand things a little bit better, whatever our beliefs might be. Thanks, guys, for watching. We'll see you again soon.